Hello A&P1 students, this is Gina Piscatelli with your second endocrine system lecture. It was given live on Wednesday, April 22nd, but the recording failed, so I am re-recording it or re-narrating it. This lecture deals with hormones of the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, and the details that you need to know are listed in study questions 5 and 6. So the reason that I'm covering the hypothalamus and pituitary gland hormones is that they have the widest reaching effect throughout the body. So together they can control our growth and development, how well we balance water and keep our fluid levels like blood normal. That helps with reproduction, producing egg and sperm. That's what gametogenesis means. They influence basal metabolic rate, the stress response, blood glucose levels, and not to mention things that happen during birth and delivery like uterine contractions and then milk let down immediately afterwards. So the first part that we're going to do is look at the anatomy of the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland to understand how they are anatomically connected, and then we will look at the individual hormones made by the hypothalamus and then the hormones made by the anterior pituitary gland, or the pituitary gland in general. So the anatomy of the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland is important because the hormones that are made in the hypothalamus vary in terms of which they affect. Do they affect the anterior part of the pituitary or the posterior part? One thing to keep in mind as some of the anatomical terminology comes up is that the pituitary gland is also called the hypophysis. So if the pituitary gland is also called the hypophysis, in the front, the lobe in the anterior region is called the adenohypophysis, and the posterior lobe, the lobe in the back, is called the neurohypophysis. And you know that the pituitary gland in general hangs off of a stalk called the infundibulum from the hypothalamus, right there. Now the names of these different lobes of the pituitary, we often just say anterior lobe of the pituitary or posterior lobe versus adenohypophysis. And in fact we usually abbreviate it, and it's very common to say anterior pituitary, and that means the adenohypophysis, or it means the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. Sometimes we also just say posterior pituitary to refer to the posterior lobe or the neurohypophysis. Just so you know, there's always oral shortcuts. Now the names adenohypophysis and neurohypophysis come from the types of tissue that are present in each lobe. So the anterior pituitary, there's a histology picture over here, is made up of epithelial cells, and the prefix adeno often refers to epithelial cells, or it does refer to epithelial cells. So the anterior lobe epithelial tissue will actually make hormones and release those hormones to the bloodstream. The posterior lobe of the pituitary is really nervous tissue. It's the ends of axons that came from the hypothalamus. And so this is really not where hormones are made. It's really the site where the hormones are stored in axon terminals, and then they will be released from those axon terminals, just like a neurotransmitter is released. Okay, now how is the hypothalamus connected to the different lobes of the pituitary? Well, you know, generally speaking, we call the stalk of tissue the infundibulum. But in fact, there's two separate structures located in the infundibulum. One structure is a network of blood vessels called the hypophyseal portal system, and it's listed as number 1 up here. These vessels, they're called portal vessels and capillary beds, connect the anterior lobe with the hypothalamus. So often the anterior lobe is drawn as kind of dark red to signify the fact that there's a lot of blood vessels in this region. And it probably appears that way in real life as well. The second structure within the infundibulum is actually a tract of axons that connect the posterior lobe to the hypothalamus. And this has just the most awful name, but they didn't ask me, so it's the Hypothalamic-Hypophyseal Tract. So Hypothalamic-Hypophyseal Tract. So it's the tract that goes to the posterior lobe. We're going to look at that in more detail right now. So, speaking of the posterior lobe down here, I mentioned that there are axon terminals where hormones are stored. Those hormones are actually produced up in the hypothalamus in the neuron cell bodies. So up in the hypothalamus where the neurosomas are, the nucleus with all the other organelles, is where the hormones are made. Sometimes they're called neurohormones because they're made by neurons. And then the hormones will travel down the length of the axons that are within the infundibulum's hypothalamic-hypophyseal tract. Then the hormones get stored in the axon terminals. If a nerve impulse stimulates, or some sort of stimulus stimulates these neurons, they will send many action potentials or another nerve impulse down the length of the axon, and that will cause the release of the hormones. So an impulse that runs the length of the axons will result in the release of hormones. And then these hormones will enter the blood capillaries. And these blood capillaries are different than the capillaries that are in the anterior lobe. This is a specific capillary bed that surrounds the posterior lobe. Now let's talk about the hypophyseal portal system that's in the infundibulum. A portal system is a network of veins that carry blood from one capillary bed to another capillary bed. Now this is a little bit unusual because usually blood goes through just one systemic capillary bed. And I'm going to try to demonstrate what I mean. So if we start with blood being pumped by the heart, it goes out an artery. And then the vessels get smaller and smaller and smaller until you have what's called a capillary bed. This is a perfect site for diffusion of nutrients. So nutrients can diffuse across the small walls of these vessels, or thin walls of these small vessels. But eventually the capillary beds, the capillaries, merge together and carry the blood that has dropped off its nutrients back to the heart. The vessel, the merged vessel here, is a vein. So that's just one capillary bed between the heart and back to the heart. But here we have a different scenario. Here we have blood coming from the heart traveling in an artery, and the artery diverges into capillaries, and so we have a capillary bed. That's no big surprise. diffusion of materials across the wall of the capillaries happens here. And we do have merging of the capillaries into veins, venous vessels. But the weird thing is these veins then diverge and they form a second capillary bed. This just provides another location for diffusion to take place. Diffusion across thick artery walls is not efficient, but across capillary beds or capillary walls it is efficient. So the portal system consists of two capillary beds and these portal veins. This is how the hypothalamus is connected to the anterior pituitary. So what happens is that the hormones made by neurons in the hypothalamus do pretty much the same thing as we've seen before. They travel down the length of the axons, but the axons end right here. And the hormones are released into the first capillary bed. Now the hormones travel in the portal veins, enter the second capillary bed, and then the hormones diffuse out of the capillary bed to reach their target organ, which is the anterior pituitary or anterior lobe of the pituitary. After the hormone is dropped off, of course, the blood continues to flow and eventually it'll go back to the heart. So collectively, both of these systems, the tract and the portal system, as well as all the neurons in the hypothalamus, create 6 hormones and carry 6 hormones that are amino acid based or peptide hormones. 2 of those 6 are going to be stored in the posterior lobe axon terminals. 4 of them are going to be released into this first capillary bed, travel through the portal system, and then be released in the second capillary bed. So we're going to talk about each one of these hormones individually. First, the hormones made in the hypothalamus that end up in the posterior lobe of the pituitary are oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. The targets of oxytocin are the uterus and the mammary glands. So they're very important, this hormone is very important for delivery as well as birth, labor contractions, but also the availability of milk to the newborn baby. Then the second hormone is called antidiuretic hormone. And just to give you a clue about what it does, diuresis means to urinate. So antidiuretic hormone is going to decrease the amount of urine produced. It does so by acting on the kidneys. So ADH enters the bloodstream, travels to the kidney, and the kidneys will retain water or reabsorb it, if you will, and not allow it to be released in the urine. Ultimately, this is important for maintaining our blood volume. Okay, the 4 hormones that instead enter the hypophyseal portal system will affect the anterior pituitary lobe. All 4 of them are what we call releasing hormones, meaning they're going to cause the pituitary to release hormones. They are also referred to as tropic hormones. And there's 2 characteristics that meet this criteria of being a tropic hormone. A tropic hormone stimulates its target to grow in some way. Either the cells multiply and you get more cells, or the cells get bigger. The other thing that a tropic hormone does is cause the target to secrete a hormone. So that's kind of the same as a releasing hormone. So you can call all of these hormones that enter the hypophyseal portal system releasing hormones or tropic hormones. The names of these four hormones are kind of tongue twisters. The first one, gonadotropin releasing hormone, is going to cause the anterior pituitary to release a gonadotropin. So not only is GnRH tropic, but the hormone that it causes to be released is also tropic. Another example of the four is thyrotropin releasing hormone, and it causes the anterior pituitary to release a thyrotropin. And the thyrotropin is tropic, and so is this TRH. Corticotropin releasing hormone, made by the hypothalamus, causes the anterior pituitary to release a corticotropin, which is a tropic hormone, and it will affect the adrenal cortex, and we'll come back to that. The last hypothalamus hormone is the growth hormone releasing hormone. Instead of using tropic in its name, somebody decided releasing hormone was good enough. It is going to cause the anterior pituitary to release growth hormone. So let's just review these four hypothalamic hormones that enter the hypophyseal portal system to act on the anterior pituitary. First, all the hormones are made by neurons and released into this first capillary bed. So the neurons release the hormone, and then the hormone moves into the capillary bed. Then the hormone travels through a portal vein, and it reaches the second capillary bed, labeled number 4, and that capillary bed surrounds the anterior pituitary lobe. Then the hormone leaves the capillary bed, and its target will be the cells in the tissue of the anterior pituitary. So the hormone will bind to a receptor on an anterior pituitary cell. Now it's time to look at the actions of these hypothalamus hormones. Here are their abbreviations: thyrotropin releasing hormone, gonadotropin releasing hormone, corticotropic releasing hormone, growth hormone releasing hormone. Big names, right? So we'll do 2 and then 2. So thyrotropin releasing hormone causes the anterior pituitary, so it goes down, it targets the anterior pituitary, and in response the anterior pituitary makes TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone, and it is tropic. It is tropic because what it does is it acts on the thyroid gland to make the thyroid gland produce another hormone, which we know as thyroid hormone. Okay, so that's TRH. Now let's look at gonadotropic releasing hormone. Gonadotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, acts on the anterior pituitary, and in response the anterior pituitary makes 2 hormones, which are both gonadotropins, and I have that word here, and their specific names are follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. They are tropic. They are going to make the gonads grow. But they also make the gonads, the testes, and the ovary release hormones. The testis will release the main male sex steroid hormone you know of, testosterone, and the ovary makes progesterone in response. Progesterone is really important for maintaining the placenta during pregnancy, and it's also a constituent of birth control, pills or injections or whatever delivery mechanism is used. Okay, so now the other two hypothalamic hormones are CRH and GHRH. CRH is corticotropin releasing hormone, and it causes the anterior pituitary, it's shown here in the blue line, it causes the anterior pituitary to make a tropic hormone to the adrenal cortex. So it acts on the adrenal gland, which sits above the kidney, and the adrenal cortex is the superficial layer. This hormone that's tropic to the adrenal cortex is called Adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH for short. It is tropic because it's going to make the adrenal cortex release another hormone, which is called cortisol. And we're going to review that again, but at least you have it once now. And then the last hypothalamic hormone is growth hormone releasing hormone coming from the hypothalamus. It affects the anterior pituitary, causing the anterior pituitary cells to make growth hormone. And growth hormone has many targets: bones, fat, muscle, liver, and it is tropic. I mean, it's called growth hormone, so it has to be tropic. And we'll talk about what it does for those organs a little bit later. So we first had the hypothalamus release TRH, which affected the anterior pituitary and caused it to make thyroid stimulating hormone. That will act on the thyroid gland. Then we had the gonadotropic releasing hormones from the hypothalamus, causing the anterior pituitary to make luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, and both of these target the ovaries and the testes. Then we had corticotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, caused the anterior pituitary to release ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, and that acts on the cortex of the adrenal gland. And then finally we had growth hormone releasing hormone from the hypothalamus act on the anterior pituitary to release growth hormone. And growth hormone has many target cells. Now we'll look at what happens in the target cells. So TSH from the anterior pituitary causes the thyroid gland to grow. Mainly mitosis happens, but also the cells become bigger because they're making a lot of thyroid hormone, which will be released through secretory vesicles. So in response to TSH, the thyroid gland makes thyroid hormone. And we care about thyroid hormone because it has an effect to increase our basal metabolic rate. That means it increases ATP production of cells throughout the body, and it also lowers glucose because you have to use the glucose to make the ATP. You don't have to remember those details though. Okay, so now let's do the gonadotropins. So the two gonadotropins released by the anterior pituitary are FSH and LH. So I'll talk about FSH first. It is called follicle stimulating hormone, and it acts on the ovary to cause oocytes to mature, or an egg, an ovum. There's a lot of words for the female gamete. Ovum, oocyte, egg. So oocyte maturation. And it also causes the testes to make sperm. So we're really talking about FSH making gametes here. Luteinizing hormone is a little bit different. Luteinizing hormone acts on the ovary to release the ovum and to make a progesterone hormone, and it causes the testes to release testosterone. So those are the gonadotropins. The actions of adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, on the adrenal cortex is to cause it to make cortisol, which I mentioned previously. This is our long-term stress hormone, not a short-term stress like, you almost ran into something on the road or something like that. Long-term stress. Long-term stress. And cortisol, it helps with the stress response by doing a number of things, but one that's really easy to remember is that it raises blood glucose so that there's more energy available to fight or flee, like the sympathetic response kind of. Okay, now finally, growth hormone. Growth hormone is released by the anterior pituitary, and it has a wide range of effects. It causes bone, skeletal muscle, and cartilage to actually get bigger. Mitosis occurs, that means cell division, so you get more cells, and the cells mature. We call that cellular differentiation. The ultimate goal is to cause growth or tissue of an organ. So that happens in the skeletal muscles, the bone, it happens in adipose, it happens in cartilage. But growth hormone also has some basic metabolic effects too. And we consider these glucose sparing effects. What that means is we're trying to keep blood glucose at a certain level so that it is available throughout the body if needed by any cell, really. Blood glucose level. I'm trying to keep it stable. So, growth hormone acts on adipose tissue, making it break down lipids, and that releases another energy source so the blood glucose doesn't have to be used for a nutrient. In the liver, growth hormone promotes the breakdown of glycogen, which just releases more glucose into the blood, so it helps keep blood glucose up. The other thing that growth hormone does for all cells in the body is it promotes their ability to take up amino acids from the blood and use those for ATP synthesis instead of glucose. So as you can imagine, with all these different anterior pituitary hormones, there could be quite a range of disorders associated with each type of hormone. And of course there are different cells in the anterior pituitary that make these different hormones. One cell does not make all the hormones. So I just chose 2 disorders related to growth hormone to talk about how problems with the pituitary might be seen. So in the case of growth hormone, usually the disorders are seen right away in childhood or puberty, adolescence, when there's a growth spurt. And so there are 2 disorders. One is that the pituitary is making too much growth hormone. That's called hypersecretion. Or the second, the pituitary gland is making too little growth hormone. That's called hyposecretion. So what you can see ultimately in adults, if these disorders persist, is with hypersecretion you see gigantism. And even though that's kind of a strange or disturbing word to use, their adult height is extremely tall, like 8 feet or more. And in hyposecretion you would see dwarfism. Now there are many other causes of dwarfism having to do with skeletal system development that aren't related to the pituitary, but there is something called pituitary dwarfism. It's just very rare. So first let's just mention a little bit about hypersecretion of growth hormone and what you would see, what the first signs would be if the pituitary was making too much growth hormone. You really wouldn't see anything in childhood. It wouldn't be until puberty, and even then I don't know that people would pick it up for sure unless they knew it was a problem in the family. So notice that the nose is a little broad and the chin is becoming square-like. So that's what you usually see through adolescence, is a progression, and you can see here in age 83, is a thickening of bones in the hands, feet, and face. So here we can see it in the face, and at age 52, I think this probably had already been apparent, but this is the same woman all the way from age 9 to 52. You see that the hands are much larger than normal. In hyposecretion cases, pituitary dwarfism, it is usually picked up pretty quickly right after adolescence, because if a child is not growing, they usually test for it. And they usually doesn't persist all the way to dwarfism because we have medical interventions, and that they include genetically modified or engineered growth hormone that we can make, in a lab from bacteria, and so we can inject this growth hormone and take care of the problem. So those are just 2 pituitary disorders. The next set of slides are review slides, just questions for you to answer, and at the bottom of the slide in the notes section I have all the answers written for the next 3 slides. So if we go to this one, again I've got the answers written and this slide. And then finally I found this table online somewhere, and I just thought it was a nice way to summarize all the hormones that we just talked about, the posterior pituitary and the anterior pituitary hormones. Thank you. That was the lecture from Wednesday, April 22nd.